In 1973, Princess Anne was deeply in love with Andrew Parker Bowles, but when he chose Camilla instead and married her, Anne buried her heartbreak, married someone she didn't truly love, and repeated the same dutiful sacrifice that had destroyed her Aunt Margaret and would later destroy Diana. Now you will hear a dramatized reflection inspired by the emotions, relationships, and public struggles behind this chapter of royal history. Princess Anne was 22 years old when she fell in love with Andrew Parker Bowles, and for a brief, shining moment, she believed she could have what her Aunt Margaret had been denied. Andrew was everything that appealed to a young woman raised in the rigid constraints of royal life. He was a dashing cavalry officer, handsome and charming, with an easy confidence that came from aristocratic breeding without the suffocating weight of royalty. He made Anne laugh. He treated her like a woman rather than a princess, and in the early 1970s, when Anne was just beginning to understand who she was beyond her title, that felt revolutionary. They met at social events, shared private moments stolen from the relentless schedule of royal duties, and for Anne it felt like genuine connection rather than the performative relationships that dominated palace life. She was falling in love, perhaps for the first time, certainly the most intensely, and she allowed herself to imagine a future where duty and happiness might coexist. But Andrew Parker Bowles was not exclusively Anne's. He was also seeing Camilla, another well-connected aristocrat who moved in the same circles. Andrew was known for enjoying female company, for being charming with multiple women simultaneously, for keeping his options open in ways that aristocratic men of that era often did without consequence. Anne knew about Camilla, of course. Everyone in their social circle knew Andrew dated both women, but Anne believed she would win. She was, after all, a princess, the queen's only daughter, attractive, intelligent, accomplished in her own right. Surely Andrew would choose her over Camilla, who was lovely but ordinary, titled but not royal, charming but not princess material. Anne underestimated two things. First, Andrew's Catholicism made marrying into the royal family complicated, potentially impossible given the religious restrictions that still governed royal marriages. Second, Camilla offered something Anne couldn't: uncomplicated companionship without the burden of royal duty, expectations, or protocol. When Andrew proposed to Camilla in early 1973, Anne's world shattered. But no one knew the real consequence of that choice, or how it would echo through decades of royal heartbreak. Andrew Parker Bowles chose Camilla, and they married on July 4, 1973, in a Catholic ceremony at the Guards Chapel. Princess Anne attended the wedding. She stood there, composed and appropriate, watching the man she loved marry another woman, and she smiled through it, because that's what royal training taught her to do: hide the pain, maintain the facade, never let them see you break. Inside, Anne was devastated. She had genuinely believed Andrew would choose her, that love and royal status would be enough. His choice felt like rejection at the deepest level, not just of her as a woman, but of everything she represented. And in that moment, attending Andrew and Camilla's wedding with perfect royal composure, Anne made a decision that would shape the next 2 decades of her life. She would follow the path of duty, marry someone appropriate, bury her heartbreak, and prove she could sacrifice personal happiness for institutional expectations. 4 months later, on November 14, 1973, Princess Anne married Captain Mark Phillips in Westminster Abbey. The wedding was grand, televised, watched by millions who saw a radiant princess marrying a handsome military man. What they didn't see was Anne's internal calculation. Mark Phillips was safe. He was appropriate. He came from good English stock, military background, shared Anne's interest in horses and equestrian competition. He posed no religious complications, no scandal, no difficulty for the palace to manage. But Anne didn't love him, not the way she had loved Andrew, not with that breathless intensity that had made her believe happiness might be possible. Mark was a choice made from duty rather than desire, and Anne knew it even as she walked down the aisle. She was 23 years old, heartbroken, and consciously choosing to repeat the same sacrifice her Aunt Margaret had made 20 years earlier when she gave up Peter Townsend. Anne understood the cost. She married Mark anyway. The marriage was doomed from the start, though it took years for that doom to become publicly visible. Anne and Mark had 2 children, Peter and Zara, and in the early years there was functionality if not passion. They attended events together, fulfilled their roles, maintained appropriate appearances, but underneath, the marriage was hollow. Mark struggled with being Prince Consort in everything but name, living in Anne's shadow, defined by his wife's position rather than his own accomplishments. Anne, for her part, found Mark increasingly dull, uninteresting beyond horses and military matters, incapable of the intellectual and emotional connection she craved. They grew apart not dramatically but gradually, the slow erosion of a relationship that had never been built on solid foundation. By the 1980s, both were having affairs, seeking elsewhere what the marriage didn't provide. Mark's infidelities became public first, embarrassing Anne and confirming what she already knew. They had both made a mistake, but royal duty kept them trapped in it. What happened next would show how thoroughly the pattern of dutiful sacrifice repeated across generations. Princess Margaret had sacrificed Peter Townsend in 1955, told she couldn't marry a divorced man and remain in line of succession. She chose duty, spent decades unhappy, turned to alcohol and difficult relationships, and never fully recovered from that choice. Anne, knowing Margaret's story intimately, still made the same sacrifice in 1973. She chose duty over Andrew Parker Bowles, married Mark Phillips without genuine love, and spent 19 years in an increasingly unhappy marriage. Then came Diana, who married Charles in 1981, in what was explicitly a duty match rather than love match. Charles was still in love with Camilla, Diana was young and naive, and the marriage was arranged to produce heirs and satisfy institutional requirements. Like Anne, Diana found herself trapped in a loveless royal marriage, suffering privately while performing happiness publicly. 3 royal women, 3 generations, all sacrificing personal happiness for duty, all ending up miserable. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention, but the institution kept perpetuating it, kept prioritizing stability over individual well-being, kept teaching that duty mattered more than love. But no one knew the real consequence of Anne's sacrifice, or how watching Camilla's subsequent trajectory would make that sacrifice feel even more bitter. In 1995, Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla divorced after 22 years of marriage. Camilla was immediately free to pursue her relationship with Prince Charles openly, and by the late 1990s, they were a recognized couple. Anne watched this unfold with complicated feelings. The woman Andrew had chosen over her, the woman who had inadvertently caused Anne's heartbreak, was now positioned to become the most important woman in the royal family outside the Queen herself. Camilla attended royal events. She was gradually accepted by the family. She became Charles's constant companion, and eventually, after Charles and Diana's tragic story concluded, Camilla married Charles in 2005 and became Duchess of Cornwall, later Queen Consort, when Charles became king in 2022. Anne witnessed all of it. She saw Camilla receive acceptance, position, and ultimately a crown, while Anne's own dutiful marriage had crumbled into divorce and years of unhappiness. The irony was devastating. Anne had sacrificed her happiness to do the right thing, to follow the rules, to to prioritize duty. Camilla had followed her heart, married Andrew despite Anne's feelings, later divorced him to be with Charles, and ended up with everything. Anne's own path to happiness was slower and harder one. She finally divorced Mark Phillips in 1992 after years of separation, and later that same year, she married Commander Timothy Laurence, a naval officer she had fallen in love with genuinely. Timothy was different from Mark, intellectual, warm, genuinely interested in Anne as a person rather than a princess. The second marriage was everything the first wasn't, built on real affection, mutual respect, genuine partnership. Anne finally found the happiness she had been denied in 1973, but she was 42 years old by then, not 23. She had lost nearly 20 years to a dutiful marriage that satisfied institutional requirements, but destroyed her personal well-being. And even in her happiness with Timothy, Anne carried the knowledge of what those lost years had cost her. Her youth, her optimism, her belief that doing the right thing would be rewarded. The institution had taught her that duty mattered most, and she had believed it, and it had nearly broken her. And what happened next showed how Anne's experience shaped her approach to the younger generation facing similar choices. When her nephew William began seriously dating Kate Middleton in the 2000s, Anne was one of the few senior royals who consistently supported the relationship. She understood what it meant to be forced into a duty marriage versus marrying someone you genuinely loved. She saw in William's patient courtship of Kate something she hadn't had with Mark: actual partnership, mutual affection, the foundation for a sustainable marriage. Anne reportedly told William privately that marrying someone you love matters more than marrying someone who checks institutional boxes, that the cost of a duty marriage is too high, that he shouldn't repeat the mistakes of previous generations. Whether William took Anne's advice specifically or simply learned from the family's collective romantic disasters, his marriage to Kate has been notably successful, built on years of dating and genuine compatibility rather than institutional arrangement. Anne's suffering, in that sense, contributed to breaking the cycle, teaching the next generation that duty and happiness don't have to be mutually exclusive. But the question remained whether Anne's sacrifice had been necessary or simply tragic. Some argued she had no real choice in 1973, that marrying Andrew Parker Bowles would have been impossible given his Catholicism and the religious restrictions governing royal marriages at that time. Others pointed out that those restrictions were eventually changed, that Anne could have waited, could have fought harder, could have chosen differently. Anne herself rarely spoke publicly about Andrew or the choices she made in her 20s. She maintained the same composed, no-nonsense public persona she had cultivated for decades, working harder than almost any other royal, taking on hundreds of engagements annually, building a reputation as the most dedicated member of the family. But those who knew her well suggested the hard work was partly compensation, partly distraction, partly proving that even if she couldn't have personal happiness for years, she could still fulfill her duty impeccably. The parallels to Margaret's story were impossible to ignore. Both women fell in love with men deemed inappropriate by royal standards. Both were told, explicitly or implicitly, that they couldn't have what they wanted. Both sacrificed their romantic happiness for duty. Both suffered through years of unhappiness as a result. Both eventually found some measure of contentment later in life. Margaret in her friendships and creative pursuits, Anne in her second marriage and her work. But both also carried the weight of what might have been the ghost of the happiness they were denied. The institution that demanded their sacrifice never adequately compensated them for it, never acknowledged that perhaps the rules that forced such choices were wrong, never apologized for prioritizing abstract concepts like duty and protocol over human well-being. Anne's brutal truth was that she sacrificed love for duty, married without genuine affection, spent decades in an unhappy marriage, and watched the woman who won the man she loved ultimately triumph in ways Anne never could. Camilla got Andrew, then got Charles, then got a crown. Anne got duty, then got divorce, then got happiness, only after years of suffering. The institution called Anne's choice noble and proper. Anne might privately call it the biggest mistake of her life. She followed the rules, did everything right according to royal standards, and was rewarded with nearly 20 years of misery. The lesson seemed clear. Doing your duty doesn't guarantee happiness. Following the rules doesn't mean you'll be rewarded, and sometimes sacrifice is just sacrifice, painful and costly, and not compensated by anything except the cold satisfaction of knowing you followed protocol. But Anne survived it, ultimately, and perhaps that's the real story. She made the dutiful choice in 1973, suffered through its consequences, and eventually found her way to genuine happiness with Timothy Laurence. She broke the cycle for the next generation by quietly advocating for William to marry for love. She built a life of meaningful work and dedication that gave her purpose beyond romantic fulfillment. And she demonstrated something important about the cost of royal duty. It's real, it's high, and it's paid primarily by the individuals forced to subordinate their happiness to institutional requirements. Anne paid that cost fully, and she wants the younger generation to understand it was too high, that the rules that demanded such sacrifice were wrong, that duty matters but not more than being able to live authentically and love genuinely. The brutal truth Princess Anne lived was that the institution demanded everything and gave back very little. It demanded she sacrifice the man she loved, marry someone appropriate instead, maintain appearances while her marriage crumbled, smile through watching her rival win everything, and never complain publicly about any of it. She did all of that. She followed every rule, and she spent nearly 20 years unhappy as a result. Only by finding Timothy, only by building a second marriage based on genuine affection, only by working harder than anyone else to prove her worth beyond romantic choices, did Anne finally find some measure of peace. But the cost of getting there, the years lost to duty, the happiness delayed until middle age, the heartbreak buried and never fully processed, that cost was real, and Anne wants everyone, especially the younger royals navigating their own romantic choices, to understand that the institution's demands are not worth that price. Choose love when you can. Don't sacrifice happiness for duty if there's any other option. The rules that force such choices are wrong, and the cost of obeying them is too high. That's Anne's brutal truth, learned through decades of painful experience. She paid the price so perhaps others won't have to.